Hi, I'm Nikki, the Obsessive Bookseller. Welcome to my channel. This is episode 3 of my book review Blitz series, where I talk about books that didn't quite have enough substance, appeal, strong opinions to warrant a standalone book review for it, but I still wanted to share my thoughts on it. It's important to me to review everything that I read on this channel, and I do a pretty decent job of giving you the tidbits during my wrap-ups, but I wanted to get into a little more depth with some of these. I will not be including the other books you might like section in this particular Blitz, but I will link all of my reviews in the description. So if you would like recommendations for other books you might like for each one, you can click on that and it'll take you to the Goodreads review. And same with ever, my intention is to review books as I read them and not try to do a Blitz all in 1 week. So I have a couple I'm going to do today, and then as I read a few more and write a few more reviews, I'll add a few later on, and then we'll close out the video. The first one I'd like to review is Infidel by Cameron Hurley. It's book 2 in the Beldam Apocrypha series. And I gotta say, this author is so freaking weird. But that's part of the reason why I think I like her so much, and I keep getting drawn back to her stories. She is not afraid to go there in books. She challenges the status quo of society constantly. She's not afraid to talk about taboo topics, and she presents all of that with some of the most creative world building I've ever come across. There's so much stuff going on in her worlds. It's so wild and bizarre that she doesn't even have enough time to highlight all of her good ideas in her books. For example, in this one, the magic system in this sci-fi world is based off of the life energy of bugs. They use it for everything from healing to powering their cars. And it almost seems like an afterthought thrown in. It's kind of like just, casually, like, I'm just gonna go get a new kidney, no problem. And meanwhile, there's so many other creative things going on in this world that it's just... And that kind of goes both ways, because I could easily take more time spent with the magic system and kind of even explaining what's going on with the main kind of periphery conflict of this whole world. But anyway, color me wildly impressed. This is the 3rd book I've read from her so far, and she is a very visceral writer. I have to go into these stories a little bit braced, because it's some of the darkest, uncomfortable things that I've read. And granted, I don't read horror, so I'm sure there's a whole mess of stuff in there that I don't even want to look at. What she has a tendency to do is to rely on shock value to evoke emotions and connection from the reader. It worked well for me in Mirror Empire, and in the first book in this series, it also worked well. For me in this one, the shock value, she took it a little bit too far in my opinion. And she's such a good writer, and her stories are so compelling that I don't think she needs the shock value aspect. And so for me, it kind of cheapened the book a bit. Now, I did buddy read this with a couple of friends, and it didn't bother them as much as it bothered me. And I will say the thing that she chose to emphasize with shock value is one of my only reading triggers. So, of course, it's going to affect me more negatively than most people. But in any case, it was enough to affect my rating a little bit. The first book in this series, I had trouble with the main character. She felt very inconsistent to me, and more like a tool to advance the plot as opposed to like a fully rounded character. Some of her convictions would just come out of nowhere. It wouldn't follow any logical thought process. It would be, suddenly she's a new woman today. And I know some people are like that, but it wasn't plausible for me in the book. In this second book, much better for me. Her character was a lot more consistent. I found a bigger connection to her. I don't really like her, which is kind of fun. You've got kind of an anti-hero thing going on here. But above all, I am really interested to see where this story ends in the next book, so I find myself eager to continue on. I might even pick up some of the short stories, because there are a few components in here that, like I said, don't get a lot of attention, even though they seem like they should be pretty integral to the plot. So I'm wondering if she covered that in some side writings or whatever. So yes, weird sci-fi, somewhat unnecessary shock value, coming in at a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next in this Blitz, I'd like to review Signet by Patricia McKillop. This is actually a 2-in-1. The first book is The Sorceress and the Signet, and this will be a DNF review, as I put it down at about the 40% mark. I have this really fun Q&A template that I borrowed with permission from another book blogger years ago, and I love how informative it is. Because just because a book didn't work well for me doesn't mean it won't work well for you. But anyway, I'm going to kind of go through those questions as we go through this review. First and foremost, did you give Signet a chance? And I think at 40% I definitely did, although it is such a short book that I think I probably could have continued reading to the end. But I was at the point where I knew it wasn't for me, and I knew even if I pushed myself to read to the end, I would have like a mild payoff of curiosity, but it was still only going to be a 2-star book at best. So 40% into a short book, it only took me a few days to get that far. I don't know, I felt like I could have committed more, but I just wasn't liking it. I think the answer to that is yes. Have I enjoyed other books in the same genre? I'm not really sure how to classify this. Really outdated classic fantasy? Like, some fantasy novels hold up really well to time. This one did not age well at all for me. The writing style was archaic and clunky, and a lot of people praise it as kind of a unique writing style, but for me, it was so heavy-handed to the point where it got in the way of clarity to the reader. And I think if you're going to get fancy with it, at least make sure you're still conveying what you want to the reader. I had to reread a couple of pages. Just like, what did I just read? Did I just not absorb it? Am I not making sense out of what she said? And she has a tendency to chop sentences to the fact where some of them don't even have a subject and a verb in the same sentence. That means it's not really a sentence. But, you know, I don't mind creative writing styles. I love it when authors play around with things like that. But like I said, not when it's at the sacrifice of me understanding what they're trying to say. So I like classic fantasy, I don't like weird fantasy. Did you have expectations before starting it? I read this one for my Read, Burn, Hoard challenge, and I'd been hanging on to it for years because of the cover appeal. I mean, look at this, it's got dragons all over the cover. And actually I was hoping that because dragons have long necks, that in this world they would be called signets. But no, at least in the first book I read, there are no dragons at all. They are actually talking about a swan. So why they don't have a cover of swans? I don't know, because they know if they put a dragon on the cover, people like me will buy it without even knowing if I'm gonna like it. I will always buy the dragon covers. What I was not expecting was how weird the book was. And here's the kicker, what ultimately made you stop reading? The very first chapter of the book had some cool mystical elements, talked about gods and this like pastoral family, this boy's kind of connection to them. It set things up as if we were going to get a pretty typical fantasy, but then without any warning, it kind of turned on its head and got kind of ridiculous, where I'm not even sure what the point of some of the stuff introduced. And then suddenly, very early in the book, we find ourselves in a cabin in a swamp. Like, we weren't even in a swamp. We weren't even with like endless rooms and this sorceress, and it was just bizarre. Then you brought in some prophecy elements, and then more bizarre things happened, and generally, I have a really hard time with ridiculous elements in books being in there for the sake of being ridiculous. I don't have patience for that at all. It's why I did not like Piers Anthony. Don't plan to read any more books from him. It's why I'm very, very scared to read anything from Terry Pratchett, and same thing with Douglas Adams. There's just a very specific type of bizarre humor stuff that does not work for me. Now this one had the bizarre stuff, but it wasn't even funny. So everything about it put me off. And then you get a prophecy that I'm assuming was a pretty accurate prophecy based on the placement in the book. And anytime I know anything about where the story is going to go, I lose interest. So just a number of things. Nothing about it, the writing style, the plot, or lack thereof, but weird story components and prophecy, nothing was working for me, so I put it down. There was nothing I liked about this book. In fact, I disliked the writing style so much that it caused me to donate the other Patricia McKillop books I had on my shelf, because I realized that I will never bring myself to read those. I had such a bad experience with this one, and I know authors have highs and lows, but I disliked it so much that I just know she's not for me. So another good question is, would you still recommend the book even though you didn't like it? And that's a hard one because I could not personally endorse this book. I did not enjoy anything about it, but I could see the type of reader who likes the more fanciful fantasy and who loves the idea of kind of like a campfire side weird storytelling type of vibe. I think they might enjoy it a little more than I did. So DNF, 1 out of 5 stars. Next, I'd like to review Weight of Command by Michael Mamet. As far as I know, this is a standalone book. This author is responsible for one of my all-time favorite books, Planetside, which is phenomenal. I loved absolutely everything about it. And one of the most compelling things about that book was the strength of the main character, how quick-witted he was. I love the dialogue. I love the humor. And all of his books have an element of that same type of character profile, and I love reading about him. I love analytical characters. I love smart characters. I love smart characters who make mistakes and then learn from them because they feel more human. And in this book in particular, it was a very compelling character profile. A young lieutenant kind of forced into command long before she's ready due to some circumstances well outside of her control. And it was just awesome. There was some fun back and forth politics in this book. I particularly like side characters in Mamet's books. His characters tend to surround themselves with very capable people, and they add a lot of dynamics to the story, and it means the main character doesn't have to know everything. And it brings up a cool dynamic of trying to figure out who you can trust and what type of advice to take, when to trust your gut, that kind of cerebral dynamics. I love it. And then there's a mystery element to this book where you're trying to figure out, like, why she's in this situation in the first place. So that was quite interesting. For me, this was a pretty light read. Like, if you're like me at all, what you want to take to the beach to read is sci-fi fantasy. So this is, for me, a perfect beach read because it doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's still got just enough substance to keep you page turning. Really good momentum, lots of action scenes, and a pretty decent ending. So if you like more lighthearted sci-fi, this is an excellent one to pick out, especially if you like them to have wittier characters and really good dialogue. That never suffers in any of his books. So I am landing at a 3 out of 5 star. Hello, I've got another Blitz review book for you today. I'm going to be doing Mistress of Dragons by Margaret Wise. First book in the Dragon Varald world. I read this one for my Read Burn Hoard. It's been on my shelf for like ever, and I finally made time to get around to it. And I don't know, I think this is proof that just because a book has dragons in it doesn't mean I'm automatically going to love it, because I might give off that impression with how I talk about a lot of the dragon books on my channel. This one started out really well. I liked the concept for the story, and the dragons themselves did like a little conglomeration, a meeting of sorts, and it was pretty cool. I liked the way she described the dragons. Very pretty ombre coloring, but you know, these are basically humans in dragon form based on the way they think and speak and act, and they can even shift into humans. So not really my favorite type of dragons to begin with, but you know, I went with it. So even though I like the concept right out of the gate, I didn't like the execution of it. The book felt really contrived to me. It seems like what they were doing to solve the problem was not the most efficient way to go about it. The whole time I'm reading this book, I'm thinking, why does this human have to be involved at all? And why is it this human who has to be involved? And I think the only reason for it was so that the author could get character A and character B together. And that didn't make a lot of sense, but a lot of the other plot points were kind of thin, so I just went with it. But yeah, that also brought up the question, why on earth aren't the dragons taking care of it themselves? It doesn't seem like they're adverse to conflict or anything. In fact, they have every motivation here to get involved, and the fact that they let it get to this point before they're like, oh, well, let's send a human to fix it. Nothing about it made sense. But I kept reading because overall I did enjoy the flow of the writing style. It was a very relaxing, easy read, a very quickly digestible fantasy story, even if it didn't have a lot of substance. I did like the last couple chapters that introduced another wrinkle to the story that I think I would be interested in reading in future books. But the problem is I only own them in print, and I'm not about to spend more time physically reading this series when it was just kind of mediocre run-of-the-mill. So if I do continue, it will be because my library acquired either a digital copy or an audio copy, or even better, one of those amazing Audible sales where I can just pick them up for super cheap. So I'm kind of setting the series aside as a temporary DNF, but we'll see how things go. Because I read this for Read Burn Hoard, I went into it with a little bit more research than I do for most books, and so I read a couple of reviews that were talking about trigger warnings. And this one does have one near the end of the book, so just do some research beforehand, see what you're getting into. Overall, I'm coming in at a 2 out of 5 stars. It's a very just okay read, and even the dragons couldn't save it from being mediocre. So if you just want something really light and quick, this is a good one to pick up. But other than that, there are so many other dragon books that I would recommend in its place. Hi, Nikki here with another Book Blitz review. So I'm going to be talking about The Last Graduate by Naomi Novik. I loved the first book. One of my favorites of the year. I read it. And then I let this one sit unread on my shelf for almost a year after its release date. I'd heard that the duology got turned into a trilogy, and I was worried that this one was going to be just a bunch of filler content to stretch the series, kind of like a cash grab. Well, I need to take off my fortune-telling hat and stop predicting the future with books, because this was completely satisfying. I feel like in this case, she told the complete story that she initially intended for the duology, but had so much depth and substance that it warranted expanding beyond it. And that's completely ideal, where you've just got so much good content that it warrants a third book. So I was surprised at how much I enjoyed this one. The first book was more narrowly focused and had a lot of really great intimate classroom settings and a lot of book learning, practicing spells, putting together potions, that kind of thing. Whereas this one kind of broadened things a bit and focused more on the big picture, and it was spliced here and there by some really good training sequences. So right there, classroom setting and training sequences, school settings, all things that usually draw me to books, and completely loved it within this context. But what continues to make this series stand out for me is the unique perspective of the main character. It's told with a very unconventional voice, and it's not telling you a play-by-play of what happened. It's more of, as this girl is experiencing things, it's filtered through her mind's eye and how she perceives what's going on. And it normally wouldn't work for me, because what that does is kind of stop the plot. So something would happen, and then we'd spend the rest of the chapter kind of getting her perspective from that, and implications on how that affects her chances of survival. And I have seen quite a few places, one of the reasons people didn't enjoy the first book was because of the main character. She's not exactly likable. Her problems aren't what the school is throwing at her, but rather her own attitudes and perceptions of the world. She is in her own way more often than not, and there has been some really good character growth up to this point, but she's still like jaded and cynical, and her biggest problem, and I love that about her. I think it is such a unique commitment to a character. So one of the things most people didn't like about the series is what I am championing about the series. Despite the fact that this is a school setting focused on a young female character, this does not read YA to me at all. The author would be remiss to tell a story with this age group in this type of setting without addressing hormonal issues, but that is by no means the focus of the plot. And there is a lot of talk of different cliques and groups that form within this school, but only within the context of how that affects your ability to survive. If you're not in with the cool kids and you're a loner, you're picked off pretty quickly. So it's much more from a survival standpoint as opposed to an emotional one. And it makes me so happy to find a series in a school setting with a young adult character that doesn't ring of the typical young adult baggage. Those are very hard to find. Overall, this was a great continuation. I can't wait to see what happens next. All of the plot points that she promised in the next book are super intriguing. I'm coming in at a solid 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you so much for joining me for this book review blitz. I'd like to take a moment to give a special thanks to my patrons. I really appreciate how much support and encouragement you give me for this channel. It means the world. Let me know in the comments if you read any of these books and if you resonated with some of the things I had to say about them. I'd love to hear about it. And thanks for watching. I hope to catch you next time. Bye.